Margaret Turner had never been a spontaneous woman. She liked her quiet mornings, her small garden, and the steady rhythm of her life in Seattle. But lately, everything had felt too still, too empty. Her husband David had passed away 3 years ago, and though time softened the ache, it didn't erase it. She lived alone now, surrounded by photographs and the soft hum of silence. So when her son Ethan suggested a weekend trip, she almost said no. But his insistence and gentle smile broke through her hesitation. "Mom," he said, "it'll be good for you. Just a small family getaway. Fresh air, no stress." Now, standing by the driveway with her suitcase, Margaret couldn't help but feel nervous. Ethan was loading the car, his wife Lily helping beside him. They were both young, full of energy, and Margaret often wondered when life had felt that easy for her. As she watched them laugh and pack snacks into the cooler, something warm flickered in her chest, a familiar kind of love that reminded her how much she had missed being surrounded by family. The drive began with cheerful conversation and music playing softly from the car speakers. The late summer sunlight spilled through the windows as they drove along the highway that curved between green mountains and glittering lakes. Margaret leaned her head against the window and smiled. It had been years since she'd left the city. Everything outside looked alive. The golden fields, the slow-moving clouds, the tall evergreens standing proudly along the road. Yet, even as she enjoyed the view, she noticed something odd. Ethan and Lily kept exchanging quiet looks. They whispered often, shared knowing smiles, and changed the subject whenever Margaret asked about their plans. When she asked which hotel they were staying at, Ethan simply grinned and said, "It's a surprise, Mom. You'll see." Margaret tried to laugh it off, but the curiosity gnawed at her. She wasn't used to surprises. Her life had become predictable, safe, calm, and neatly planned. Still, she decided to let them have their fun. Maybe it was just a little family joke, she thought. Hours passed. The air grew cooler as they entered the Olympic National Park area. The road twisted through pine forests, and the scent of cedar and damp earth drifted through the open window. When the lake finally appeared, Lake Crescent, vast and silver blue, Margaret gasped softly. It looked like a painting. The still water mirrored the mountains and the sky. She hadn't seen anything so beautiful in years. Ethan parked near a rustic lodge that sat right by the lake's edge. It was built of wood and stone, with ivy crawling up its sides and lanterns hanging near the porch. Birds chirped in the tall trees, and the sound of waves brushing against the rocks filled the air. Margaret stepped out of the car, taking it all in. "Oh, Ethan," she said, smiling, "this place is perfect." Her son looked pleased. "Told you it'd be worth the drive." As they carried their bags inside, Margaret couldn't shake the sense that something was being kept from her. Ethan had that mischievous smile, the one he used to wear as a boy when he'd planned a surprise for her birthday. The lobby smelled faintly of pine wood and coffee. The staff greeted them warmly, and soon they were shown to a spacious cabin-style room overlooking the lake. The windows opened to a view of the setting sun dipping into the horizon, painting the water in shades of gold and rose. Dinner that evening was simple but comforting. Grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, and apple pie for dessert. They sat outside, wrapped in sweaters, watching the lake shimmer in the fading light. For a while, Margaret forgot her curiosity and simply felt content. She laughed more than she had in months. But later, as darkness fell and the others went to bed, she found herself standing alone on the balcony. The moon had risen, large and pale, casting silver light across the water. The world felt still and peaceful, yet inside her, something stirred. A mix of longing and wonder, as if the night was holding its breath for something to happen. Margaret thought about her husband, about the life they'd built, and about the emptiness that followed after he was gone. She had learned to survive, to move through her days quietly, without complaint. But now, standing under the moonlight, she felt an ache, not just of loss, but of something missing she couldn't quite name. Behind her, the wooden floor creaked softly. She turned, expecting to see Ethan, but froze when she saw the man standing near the balcony door. He looked older than she remembered, with streaks of gray in his dark hair. But his eyes, those warm brown eyes, hadn't changed. "Margaret," he said gently, his voice carrying a note of disbelief and something deeper. Her heart stuttered. She knew that voice. She knew that face. "Daniel," she whispered. He nodded slowly, a small, hesitant smile forming. "It's been a long time." For a moment, Margaret couldn't speak. The night air felt heavy around them. Memories rushed back. Her husband's best friend. The one who had helped them through so much. The man who had quietly disappeared from her life after the funeral. She took a shaky breath. "What are you doing here?" Daniel's expression softened. "Your son called me. He thought maybe it was time we talked." Margaret blinked, stunned. Ethan had done this. Daniel stepped closer, his voice quiet but steady. "I almost didn't come, but when he told me how lonely you've been, how much you've done for everyone except yourself, I couldn't say no." Margaret's eyes glistened in the moonlight. She wanted to be angry, to demand why Daniel had stayed away for so long, but she couldn't find the words. All she felt was a sudden, deep warmth inside her chest, the kind she hadn't felt in years. "I didn't expect this," she said softly. Daniel smiled faintly. "Neither did I." The lake shimmered below them, reflecting the stars like scattered glass. The air was cool, and yet Margaret felt her heart beating faster than it had in years. Somewhere inside the lodge, Ethan peeked through the curtain and saw them standing together, both framed by the glow of moonlight and memory. He smiled quietly to himself, whispering, "It's working." Margaret turned back toward the water, her emotions swirling between surprise, confusion, and a strange, long-lost sense of hope. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time since her husband's death, she felt something shift inside her. Maybe this trip wasn't just a family getaway after all. Maybe it was the beginning of something she never knew she was waiting for. And as Daniel stood beside her in the quiet night, the sound of the gentle waves against the shore felt like the heartbeat of something new, fragile, unexpected, but beautifully alive. Margaret stood frozen on the balcony, the soft moonlight shining on Daniel's face. For a moment, the world around her went still. No sound, no movement, just the echo of his name in her heart. He looked older, yes, but his eyes carried that same warmth she remembered from decades ago, when he used to visit their house with laughter and stories. Back then, Daniel Hayes had been her husband David's closest friend. After David's death, he disappeared. No calls, no letters, nothing. Now here he was, standing in front of her after all those silent years. She finally found her voice. "Daniel, I thought you moved away. I thought you didn't want to be part of my life anymore." He gave a small, regretful smile. "I almost did, but I couldn't stay away forever. Ethan called me a few months ago. He said you were lonely." Margaret's breath caught. "Ethan, my son brought you here?" Daniel nodded slowly. "He said you've been strong for everyone but yourself. He thought maybe it was time you had someone to talk to again." I didn't know what to say at first, but when he mentioned Lake Crescent, I knew I had to come. Margaret turned toward the water, her heart heavy. She didn't know whether to feel angry, grateful, or scared. "You left when I needed someone the most," she said quietly. "David had just died. I was broken, Daniel. You were the only one who understood what I was going through. And then you disappeared. I know. I thought giving you space was the kindest thing I could do. I didn't trust myself to stay near you back then. I cared too much, and I didn't want that to confuse things." She looked up, startled. "Confuse things?" He met her eyes. I didn't want to make things harder for you. You were grieving. I couldn't risk saying something I wasn't sure you wanted to hear." A silence fell between them, deep and charged with everything they hadn't said in years. Margaret felt her heart beat faster. "And now?" she asked softly. Daniel smiled faintly. "Now I'm not running anymore." Before she could respond, Ethan appeared at the doorway, pretending surprise. "Oh, I see you two have met," he said, trying to hide his grin. Margaret gave him a look that was half shock, half amusement. "Ethan Turner," she said, "you have some explaining to do." Ethan laughed, walking over to hug her. "Mom, you always tell me I don't do anything thoughtful. So here I did something big. You used to talk about how kind Daniel was, how he helped you after Dad died. I just thought maybe you'd like to see him again." Margaret's heart softened. Her son meant well, and though she felt caught off guard, there was something sincere in his gesture. "You're impossible," she said, shaking her head. Maybe Ethan replied with a grin. "But you're smiling again?" After Ethan left them alone, Daniel and Margaret walked down to the edge of the lake. The air was crisp, and the stars shimmered above like spilled diamonds. They sat on a wooden bench, the kind that creaked when you leaned back, and for a long while, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like the space between two old songs, waiting to blend together again. Finally, Daniel said, "Do you ever think about the old days?" Margaret smiled faintly. "All the time. Especially the ones where David and you would argue over who made the better coffee." Daniel chuckled. "He never admitted I was right." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw the lines on his face, the years etched gently by time and loss. "You've changed," she said. "So have you," he replied softly, "but in the best way." Her cheeks warmed. She wasn't used to being complimented anymore. For years, she'd felt invisible, just a quiet widow living a quiet life. Yet, sitting beside Daniel now, she felt seen again, like the world hadn't quite forgotten her. They talked about small things, their children, old memories, even the music they used to love. Daniel shared that his wife had passed away 2 years ago. "Cancer," he said quietly. "It was quick. She was a good woman." Margaret placed a hand on his arm gently. "I'm so sorry." He nodded. "It's been hard, but being here tonight, talking to you, it feels like breathing again." The words struck something deep inside her. For years, she had built walls around her heart, believing that love in any form was something that belonged to the past. Yet, as Daniel spoke, she realized how much she missed connection, laughter. The sound of her name said softly by someone who cared. The moon hung low now, casting ripples of silver across the lake. Daniel looked at her with quiet sincerity. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" She turned to him. "Of course. Do you regret not saying how you felt back then?" Her heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "I mean before David got sick?" Daniel said gently. "I always wondered if maybe there was something between us we never talked about." The question caught her completely off guard. For years, that same thought had lived quietly in the back of her mind, an unfinished chapter she'd never dared to open. She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Maybe there was," she admitted softly. "But I loved my husband, and when he died, everything became a blur. You were there, and then you were gone. I didn't even have the strength to ask why." Daniel's eyes were full of regret. "Because I was a coward," he said simply. "Because I thought loving you was wrong. And by the time I realized it wasn't, it was too late." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes, but she didn't look away. "You were my friend, Daniel. Maybe you were more than that. I don't even know anymore." He smiled, a sad, hopeful smile. "Maybe we'll figure it out this time." A breeze swept across the water, lifting her hair, carrying with it the scent of pine and the sound of the night. For the first time in years, Margaret felt her heart stir, not with grief, but with a quiet, trembling sense of possibility. Daniel stood and offered his hand. "Come on, let's walk back. It's getting cold." She took it. His palm was warm, steady, as they walked toward the lodge. Side by side under the glow of the moon, Margaret felt the strangest mix of emotions: nostalgia, surprise, and a flicker of joy she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe this trip wasn't about relaxation. Maybe it was about finding something or someone she thought was gone forever. When they reached the steps of the cabin, Daniel paused. "Good night, Margaret." She hesitated, then smiled softly. "Good night, Daniel." After he left, Margaret stood by the door for a moment, her heart still racing. Inside, Ethan and Lily were asleep, unaware that the night had quietly rewritten part of her story. She looked out at the lake one last time before going in. Somewhere deep down, she knew this wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning of a chapter she never expected to open again. The morning sun rose gently over the lake, painting everything in soft gold. Margaret woke earlier than usual, feeling lighter than she had in years. The cool air drifted through the cabin window, and the sound of birds echoed in the distance. For a brief moment, she forgot where she was, then it all came back. The lake, the trip, and Daniel. She sat up slowly, replaying last night in her mind. His voice, his eyes, the way he'd spoken her name after so many years, it all felt like a dream. She'd thought those feelings had died long ago, buried under time and routine. But now they stirred again, gentle but real. When she walked to the kitchen, Ethan was already there, flipping pancakes while humming an old tune. "Morning, Mom," he said cheerfully. "Sleep well." Margaret smiled. "Better than I have in a long time." Lily poured her a cup of coffee and gave her a knowing look. "We saw you talking to Daniel last night," she said softly. "He's kind, isn't he?" Margaret nodded, trying to sound casual. "Yes, he always was." Ethan grinned. "You two look good together, like old friends catching up, or maybe something more." Margaret gave him a mock glare, but her cheeks warmed. "You're reading too much into it, young man." Still, her heart fluttered. Maybe Ethan wasn't wrong. Later that morning, they all went down to the lake. The air was crisp, the water calm, reflecting the bright sky. Daniel joined them with a fishing rod in one hand and that familiar, easy smile. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his eyes briefly meeting Margaret's. She smiled back before looking away. Pretending to watch the ducks near the shore, they spent the next few hours laughing, taking photos, and telling old stories. Daniel had a natural charm, the kind that made everyone around him feel at ease. Margaret found herself laughing freely, her worries melting away like morning mist. She hadn't felt this alive in a long time. At lunch, Ethan and Lily decided to go hiking along the nearby trail. Margaret chose to stay behind, her knees not up for long walks anymore. Daniel offered to keep her company, saying he'd rather stay near the water. They sat together on a wooden bench overlooking the lake. The air was still, and the sunlight danced on the waves. For a while, neither spoke. It was a quiet kind of peace, comfortable, familiar, and warm. Margaret finally broke the silence. "It's strange. Being here with you again after all these years, it feels like I stepped back in time." Daniel smiled softly. "I know what you mean. Being near you, it feels like the years just disappeared." She looked at him, her voice thoughtful. "When David died, I thought love ended with him. I thought that chapter of my life was over. But now I'm not sure love ever really ends. It just changes shape." Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes on the horizon. "I used to think the same. When my wife passed, I promised myself I'd never open my heart again. It felt safer that way." Margaret studied his face, her voice gentle. "And now?" He turned to her. "Now I'm not sure safety is worth loneliness." His words hung between them, soft and true. Margaret felt her chest tighten. She hadn't expected this trip to stir so many emotions. Not at her age, not after all this time. But here she was, sitting beside a man who once knew her heart better than anyone. And suddenly everything felt possible again. After a while, she asked quietly, "You said Ethan called you? What did he tell you exactly?" Daniel chuckled. He said his mother had forgotten how to smile like she used to, that she needed a reason to laugh again. He thought maybe I could help. Margaret's eyes glistened. "He said that, yes, he talked about you for almost an hour. How you take care of everyone else but yourself. He loves you, Margaret. That's why he planned all this." Margaret swallowed hard. "He's a good boy. He reminds me of his father sometimes." Daniel leaned back, watching the water ripple. "You raised him well. He has your kindness." A soft breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and earth. Margaret looked out over the water, her voice quiet. "I didn't expect to feel this way again, Daniel. It scares me a little." He smiled gently. "You don't have to be scared. We've both lost people. We've both lived through hard years. Maybe this isn't about starting over. Maybe it's about starting again differently." Margaret turned to him, meeting his eyes. There was honesty there. No pressure, no promises, just understanding. Slowly, she reached out and touched his hand. His fingers wrapped around hers naturally, as if they'd been waiting for this moment. The world around them seemed to blur. The soft rustle of the trees, the quiet splash of the lake. For a few seconds, it felt like time had paused just for them. When they returned to the lodge later, Ethan noticed the calm in his mother's face. She looked years younger, her eyes brighter. Lily whispered to him, smiling, "Looks like your plan worked." Ethan only nodded, watching from a distance as Daniel helped Margaret up the steps. There was something unspoken between them, the kind of bond that didn't need grand gestures or loud declarations. It was gentle, patient, and deeply real. That evening, Margaret and Daniel sat by the fireplace. The cabin glowed with warm light, and the smell of burning wood filled the air. They talked for hours, sharing stories from the years they'd missed. Daniel told her about his travels, the quiet life he'd lived, and how often he'd thought of her. Margaret listened with a small smile, her heart full. "You know," she said softly, "I always wondered why you never married again." He looked at her, eyes steady. "Because I never stopped thinking about the one I didn't get to love." Her breath caught. "Daniel?" He shook his head lightly. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know." The flames flickered, and in their light, Margaret saw not just the man she'd missed, but the man who had quietly carried her memory all these years. It was overwhelming, yet peaceful. She smiled faintly. "You always had a way with words. And you always had a way of making me forget them," he replied with a grin. They laughed softly, the sound blending with the crackle of the fire. It wasn't youthful love, not the kind filled with excitement or uncertainty. It was something steadier, love rediscovered, love that understood loss and still chose warmth. As the night deepened, they stepped out onto the porch. The lake was calm, reflecting the stars above. Daniel stood beside her, his hand brushing against hers again, a silent question. She didn't pull away. Margaret looked at the sky, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. "Maybe," she whispered, "this is what healing feels like." Daniel smiled, his voice low. "Or maybe it's what living feels like again." The cool night air wrapped around them gently as they stood there, two souls who had once been broken, finding comfort in the quiet rhythm of the lake and in each other's company, for the first time since her husband's death. Margaret didn't feel like she was looking back. She was looking forward, and Daniel was standing right beside her. The evening sky blazed in shades of orange and pink. The sun sank behind the mountains. The lake shimmered with soft light, the water smooth as glass. Margaret stood by the porch railing, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, breathing in the cool air. It was their last night at the lodge, and something in her heart felt different, lighter, freer, alive. The days had passed quickly, too quickly. She had laughed, remembered, and most of all, felt again. For the first time in years, she wasn't just existing, she was living. Inside, the family was setting up for dinner. Lily arranged candles on the long wooden table while Ethan checked the grill outside. Daniel was by the fire pit, lighting small torches around the lakeside deck. He moved slowly but with quiet purpose. Every gesture felt intentional, meaningful. Margaret didn't know what he and Ethan had been whispering about all afternoon, but she could tell something was being planned. When everything was ready, Ethan called out, "Mom, come outside." She smiled, pretending to sigh. "Another surprise. Haven't you had enough fun keeping secrets this week?" "Just one more," Ethan said with a grin. As she stepped outside, her breath caught. The deck was glowing with warm light. Candles lined the railings, their flames dancing in the evening breeze. The lake stretched out before her, silver beneath the moon. Her family stood waiting, smiling, and in the center, Daniel. He looked nervous but happy, holding something small in his hand. Margaret blinked, her heart pounding. "What is all this?" she asked, her voice soft. Ethan stepped forward, his tone warm. "Mom, this trip wasn't just for rest. It was for you." for everything you've done for us, for being strong when things were hard, and for never giving up on love, even when you thought it was gone." Rhett's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Ethan." He smiled gently. "Dad would have wanted you to be happy again, and I think he'd be smiling tonight." Her throat tightened. Before she could say anything, Daniel stepped closer. His eyes met hers, steady and full of emotion. "Margaret," he began softly, "I know this is sudden, but there's something I've been carrying for a long time, something I never said when I should have." He opened the small box in his hand. Inside wasn't a ring, but a delicate silver locket. "This was my wife's," he said. "Before she passed, she told me to give it to someone who made me believe in life again. Someone who reminded me that love doesn't end, it just changes form. And that person is you?" Margaret's breath trembled. "Daniel, he took her hand gently. "I'm not asking for promises or forever. I'm just asking for a chance to be by your side, to make you laugh again, to share the quiet moments we both missed for so long. Let's not keep waiting for the perfect time. Let's just live." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at him. This man who had once disappeared from her life and somehow found his way back. Around them, the world seemed to fade. The soft hum of crickets, the rustle of the pines, the glow of the lake. All that existed was that moment. Ethan and Lily stood nearby, watching silently. They didn't need to say a word. They already knew the answer. Margaret smiled through her tears. "You know," she whispered, "I thought this was just a family trip. But it turns out it was something much more." Daniel's expression softened. "A second chance," he said quietly. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes." He opened the locket and placed it gently in her hand. Inside was a small picture, a photograph of a lake, the same one where they stood now. "I took this years ago," he said. "I didn't know why I kept it, but now I do. It reminded me that some places hold more than memories. They hold beginnings." Margaret closed the locket and held it to her heart. "Thank you, Daniel, for coming back, for being brave enough to try again." He smiled, eyes glistening. "Thank your son. He believed in both of us before we did." Ethan raised his glass from across the deck. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice strong. "And to love that never really leaves." Everyone lifted their glasses. Margaret couldn't stop smiling. The sound of laughter filled the air, gentle, genuine. The kind that comes from peace and joy finally returning home. After dinner, the night grew cooler. The family sat near the fire pit, roasting marshmallows and telling old stories. Daniel sat beside Margaret, their hands resting together quietly. No need for words. The stars spread endlessly above them, their reflection dancing in the lake below at one point. Margaret leaned closer to him and said softly, "You know, I used to think my life was already written, that everything important had already happened. But now I feel like there's still more story left." Daniel chuckled. "Then let's write it slowly." She smiled, her heart full. "Slow sounds perfect." When the fire burned low, Ethan came to sit beside his mother. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "You okay, Mom?" She nodded. "More than okay." He looked at her face, peaceful, glowing in the firelight, and felt a quiet relief. For years, he'd seen the sadness she tried to hide, the way she kept herself busy to fill the silence. Now, that silence was gone. Daniel stood and offered his hand to help her up. "Come," he said. "One last walk before we leave tomorrow." They walked along the lakeshore, the cool sand underfoot, the soft sound of water brushing the edge. Margaret looked up at the stars, feeling as if they were smiling down on her. "I wish David could see this," she said quietly. "I think he does," Daniel replied. "He's the reason I found my way back here. Some things happen because love refuses to fade." She looked at him, eyes shining. "You really believe that?" "I do now," he said, smiling. They stopped near the water. The reflection of the moon shimmered between them. Daniel reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. It was such a simple gesture, yet it carried years of emotion, the kind that words could never capture. "Margaret," he whispered, "thank you for giving me a second chance, for giving us one." She smiled softly, her voice full of warmth. No, Daniel. Thank you for reminding me that life doesn't end when someone's gone. It keeps moving, and sometimes it brings someone back to remind you how to feel again. They stood there for a long time, hand in hand, the night wrapping around them like a soft memory. The lake was calm, the stars endless, and for the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel alone. Asterisk,